All right, so now we're going to talk about plant asexual reproduction. This essentially means that the plant does not have to produce a seed or be fertilized to reproduce a whole another plant. This is a really unique aspect of plants that they're able to regenerate without having to go through sexual reproduction. And so we can say that this is also an example of vegetative propagation, which in the practice means that we can propagate plants in ways other than growing them from seed. So we can take cuttings and portions of the plant, and they will produce roots and leaves and stems and ultimately flowers. This is because all cells of plants are totipotent, and that just means that the cells are able to regenerate an entire plant. They have all of the DNA that is all the instructions in every single cell to be able to regenerate the plant. And that's unique. We can't do that. Animals can't do that. And yet there is no genetic recombination. And this means that we have to have sort of substitute organs develop. We call them adventitious. So they're sort of like not fake because they do the same functions as like roots and leaves, but they're like adventitious roots because they're developing out of non-root sources. So let's get into it. Um, aside from the fact that you can grow a plant without having to start from seed, which takes the time frame of producing an entire plant down from years to months or even weeks in some cases. So that speeds up the ability for the plant to be reproduced quickly. It also ensures uniformity. You're basically cloning that original plant many times. It also allows you to do this quickly and over large numbers of specimens can be reproduced at one time. Sometimes plants don't produce seeds that often. And even if they do, the seeds do not germinate well. So there are some challenges that some plants have and or they're very slow growing. And so propagation vegetatively is really the best option. Now, there are some downsides that it's possible to carry along disease, especially viruses, from the mother plant to the parent, the daughter plants, and so you're cloning it and you're bringing the disease along with it. It decreases genetic diversity, right? Because you're not going through sexual recombination, and some plants won't develop a taproot, and they normally would, and that can be an issue with their ability to adapt and live well in the landscape. So, in practical sense, this is we're really going to focus on the practical applications of vegetative propagation, in that we're able to take cuttings and do divisions and grafting and budding and air layering. And some of you might have trees in your own yard that are a result of grafting, or many fruit trees that we get our apples or our peaches from are a result of grafting. And you might even help your family dig up pasta plants or other plants in your garden that are perennial that can be divided by dividing up their roots, and maybe you'll give some away or share some with a neighbor. And so it's very practical application here. So what we're going to do this week in lab is we're going to do some propagation. So you saw that you can take leaves or even petioles. Petioles are like the little stem that attaches the leaf to the plant. And so you can do whole leaf or just petiole cuttings. You can just do the leaf. You don't even need the petiole in some cases. Sometimes you just need the vein, which is just the center portion of the leaf, or even just take sections of the plant. And we have examples of this with African violets or jade or Rex begonia or snake plant for all of these different ways that one can propagate from leaf cutting. You can also propagate from stems, and stems typically have some amount of wood to them. The more wood in the stem, the more difficult it is to get it to root. And so if you're taking herbaceous cuttings, that means you're taking it from the stem before it's produced wood. That would probably be the easiest. But once you start to go to softwood and semi-hardwood and hardwood, that means that the amount of wood in that stem is increasing, and it's more challenging to get a woody stem to produce roots rather than a herbaceous or even softwood stem. But stem cuttings can be taken nonetheless. So if we look at hardwood, hardwood would be sort of the most woody of the bunch. And this many examples include rose and cassava and a lot of our trees. This is typically done in the wintertime, in the time when the plant is dormant. This time of year is when there are no leaves on the tree. We say that these trees are in a dormant state, and you would take the cuttings then and induce roots when the plant is dormant. This would probably be the most challenging type of cutting there is, stem cutting. You can also do softwood stem cuttings, and this would be in early summer, late spring, and this would be on plants. They may be tropical, like passion fruit or pomegranate, but you could also do it on some of our spring flowering shrubs that have just flowered, like the lilac or forsythia. And you would take a relatively large segment, 3 or 5 inches, and including 2 nodes, which is where the leaves join with the stem. And you should see roots within 4 or 5 weeks. Then sort of an intermediate hardwood would be the semi-hardwood. This one you would do later on in the fall, late summer, early fall. And this could be things that are about to flower but haven't flowered yet or have already flowered. So I guess you can kind of figure out that you want to avoid taking a stem cutting when the plant is flowering. Why? Because the plant is putting in a lot of effort into making those flowers. And if you start cutting them up then, it's just going to divert a lot of energy away from the plant and its original goal, which is to produce seed. So you really want to avoid that time. It's a delicate time for the plant. Nonetheless, you can take a semi-hardwood cutting on some of these plants that are semi-hardwood in the late summer, early fall. In the wintertime, it's also possible to take root cuttings, especially from our brambles or members of the Rosaceae family, including rose. And so we do this here at the Alliance Garden. We dig up our roots and we propagate from there. And they're pretty easy to propagate in the wintertime. They're also dormant. So what I mean about root formation is that normally roots form from the apical meristem of the root. And that's a sort of center of the root that little epicenter says, okay, you all need to become roots. And this is how roots are normally formed. However, plants have the ability to produce another kind of root called the adventitious root. And this adventitious root forms from any other part of the plant that isn't the apical meristem of the root. So it could be on the tuber in this, or on this root in this case, or tuber of the sweet potato, or it could be from a leaf or from the stem. Now, when you're taking stem or leaf cuttings, it's really important that you maintain a condition in the chamber or in the greenhouse or even at home that is ideal. And so you want to have some light, but not too much. So indirect light, not bright light, because you really don't want to induce photosynthesis. And you want to make sure the temperature is warm, and especially where the roots are going to be developing, that has a good amount of warmth. We call that bottom heat. And if you're in the greenhouse, you might even have like warming mats so that that area gets a lot of warmth. And at that time, while the roots are forming, you don't even need water. You don't really need nutrients. You can give them a little bit of mist, but you're not really feeding them. They're pretty much just producing those roots over those 2 or 3 weeks. So over time, you will see roots that form like this. And successful rooting occurs in plants that are healthy to begin with. So the stock plants or the mother plants are healthy, that you've chosen the right time point to take those cuttings, that you're using media or soilless media that drains well. You're also giving the cuttings an adequate amount of moisture. All these factors are what enables for the cuttings to be successful. So these are just what you can expect to see, if you were doing like greenhouse production, you would see these chambers or these greenhouse bays that are very, very humid. And down at the bottom, I just have this picture of it's like a cellophane bag over a pot because you can do this at home. You don't have to do this as large scale as somebody in industry would. But in general, humidity is really important because think about it. The plant doesn't have roots right now. It needs to get moisture somehow. And having moist conditions means that the plant is less likely to lose moisture if it's in a moist environment. You can also help induce root growth, adventitious root growth, by exposing the plant to rooting hormones, in particular auxin, which we call indole acetic acid or IAA. And the rooting hormone stimulates adventitious root growth. The plant itself will make auxin, and auxin serves in different roles in the plant body, but one is to produce roots, and adventitious roots being one of them. And so you can expose that stem or that leaf to more auxin, and that will induce rooting. And so you can see in this diagram, this picture of this experiment shows 3 different stem cuttings that either did or did not receive IAA. Excuse me. And what you can see is that the increase in IAA, or in this case, it looks like they gave them IBA, which is a type of auxin that's similar. It's kind of the cousin of IAA. You can see that the higher the concentration of that auxin hormone, the higher the root mass. Now, it's also the case that you can induce this adventitious root growth on stems of plants that you have not removed from the mother plant. So all the examples we looked at before, we're taking cuttings from stems off of the plant and then rooting them elsewhere. But we can also do layering, whether it's tip or soil or air layering. Essentially, you're just inducing the plant to make more roots for a period of time and then cutting the segment, whether it's a stem or a branch off, that then has formed the roots, and then you're putting it into the ground. And we'll do this in the greenhouse with avocado or hibiscus. It really, this practice can be carried out on different plants that we have up there. And so just kind of starting with tip layering, this one is probably the easiest one and kind of happens naturally. If you've ever grown blackberries or raspberries at home, you might notice that if the stem touches the ground, it will then produce roots. So you might trip over them if you're not careful. And so you can induce this, or it just kind of happens naturally. And so um, you can cut them, and now you have new bramble plants, whether it's blackberry or raspberry. So you can see that sort of um, bend in the stem there where the roots have developed. Going back to this layering idea, the idea is that you want to wound the branch, or uh, basically induce the rooting on the stem or the tip by either touching the ground, or inducing it to think that it's touching the ground by giving it dark environment. So that's what this picture is showing you. So all of these are accomplishing essentially the same goal, which is to fool the stem essentially into thinking that it's underground, therefore it must make roots. And so this is tip layering. That is basically this, these tips of the plant are kind of dug underground and producing the root, and then you can cut it off and you have now a little rooted layer from the parent plant that you can remove and plant somewhere else. Now, separation, division are other ways that you can propagate plants vegetatively. You may have planted bulbs of some kind, whether it's garlic or tulip or gladiolas or crocus. And these are an assortment of bulbs or corms. And botanically, they're different, but essentially it works the same way, where you can take these bulbs essentially and plant them in the ground, and they will produce a plant. And then at the end of the year, you can divide them up and plant more. You also have another group that you can divide up, the crowns or the rhizomes. And this is what I was referring to in the beginning, that you can divide them up, and you'll have at the end of the summer, you'll have more of these roots or rhizomes or crowns that you can break apart and then plant in other places or give away. And this is an example of division. Now, botanically, there are some differences between bulbs and corms and roots and rhizomes. So I want to take a minute and just explain the differences here. At first, it may seem like, aren't they just all the same? But they are not. So bulbs are essentially modified leaves. And if you ever cut an onion open, you might notice it looks like just layers and layers of leaves, and that's really what it is. At the base here is a teeny tiny modified stem and then roots. So we can say a bulb is basically has a tiny short stem with fleshy leaves, and that's an onion or a tulip. Now its cousin is the corm, and it looks very similar, and it's depicted right here. And if you were to slice it open, you would see that it's actually doesn't have any leaves, but it's just a swollen underground stem. And then it makes roots off of the stem. And so some of the food crops we'll talk about later that have this corm structure is the taro or cocoyam. True roots that are essentially derived from true root tissue. The best example that we'll talk about is the sweet potato or the dahlia. And this is not to be confused with the white potato. The white potato is actually a tuber, and that's coming up here in just a second. The next category are rhizomes. These are stem-like, so very similar to a corm, except that they grow horizontally underground. And so a common example would be like bamboo or ginger or asparagus. And the last group are the tubers. These are also underground stems, but they differ from the corm in that they are short and thickened. And so you can see that the white potato is the best example of that. Okay. So again, separation division will look something like this, and usually happens in the time point when it's not flowering. So at the beginning of the season in the spring, or at the end of the season in the fall. Now, one other area of vegetative propagation is grafting. And this has been a common practice for a long, long time. The idea here is joining two plants together. One plant will be the rootstock. Basically, it's the base that has the roots. And then the scion is a shoot from the other plant that is grafted or joined into that stock. And the goal is to join the vascular cambium of the scion to the rootstock. And believe it or not, that happens pretty easily. What the vascular cambium is basically the tubes that conduct water and sugar inside the stems and the roots of each plant. Where that joining takes place, a callus will form. And that callus is really important to ensure that there is a stable connection between the grafted rootstock and the scion. So we do this because in some cases, this will be the only way that we can get adequate plants that would not reproduce well by seed. Like we don't typically start grapefruit from seed. We usually graft them, grapefruit scion onto a usually lemon or other citrus rootstock. And we're essentially producing clones. This can also speed up the rate of time that it takes to produce, say, a tree, for example, like a fruit tree. This can also be done in cases where part of the plant, like a tree, is damaged, and it can be used to repair, which is like what it's showing in that bottom right. Also, it's possible to change varieties of apple or plum, especially if consumer preferences change. If you think about when Honeycrisp got really popular, the trees themselves take about 13 years to establish before you have a really stable fruit production off of a tree. So if you were growing Granny Smith and then suddenly Honeycrisp became the rage, you could take you could take the rootstock and make the Granny Smith the rootstock, and you could take some cuttings of the scion of Honeycrisp. And after a couple of years of that graft, those grafted Honeycrisp will produce fruit. And so it's a way to speed it up and also change varieties a little bit more quickly. There are different types of grafting. I'm mentioning them all here, but I'm going to spend more time talking about a couple of the more common ways that grafting is carried out. One of them is the whip graft. You can see that you can, up here at the top, you can see the rootstock and the scion wood, and they're basically both cut at the same angle and then joined together and then wrapped and then covered so that the callus will form and the vascular cambiums will sort of knit together. Another one that we saw a picture of, but the name of it is called the cleft graft, is where you're basically just cutting into the base, maybe the trunk, and you are wedging in there the scion wood and then covering it over and sort of insulating it until it produces that joint and calluses. So this is what it could look like. This is that whip graft that I was mentioning. This looks like it's with avocado. Now, woody grafting has been practiced for hundreds and thousands of years. A newer type of grafting that has just become sort of a newer technology is vegetative grafting. And this is the idea of grafting non-woody plants together. And there are reasons why this makes sense. It's fairly laborious, and that's because a lot of these plants have a short growing time, like maybe a season versus you do a graft once for a tree and you never have to do it again. But if we're doing this in tomato, you have to do it every time you want to grow a tomato. But this has been found to increase vigor in plants that are grafted. It can reduce disease issues. It can improve yield. It can improve adaptation to environmental conditions like cold tolerance and salinity tolerance. So it can look something like this. This is work that I did with pumpkin and cucumber. And you can see that I took the pumpkin and the cucumber and essentially made a whip graft. And you can see the callus forms. And what I was looking at is can cucumbers grow in cooler conditions when grafted? That's the idea. And we did find that when you grafted a cucumber onto the pumpkin, it did improve yield, especially during colder conditions. Now, something important to note about grafting is that it doesn't impart any flavor or characteristics from the rootstock to the scion. So even if you're doing pumpkin and cucumber and you wanted the cucumber, I'm not going to get like an orange cucumber just because it has pumpkin rootstock. Similarly, if I'm using like sour cherry rootstock and want sweet cherry scion, I'm going to get sweet cherry. I am not going to get sour cherry. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is what it can look like in tomato as well. Now, there are challenges with this type of grafting. It has been limited in success, and it's fairly expensive to get the seeds. So I'll be following this trend in vegetative grafting to see what comes of it in the future. One other type of propagation I'm just going to touch on is this idea of tissue culture. If you go into the grocery store today, I guarantee you're going to see orchids that look like this. And these are Phalosophus orchids, and they are ones that are pretty common. And yet, orchids in and of themselves are very difficult to propagate in that they don't produce seeds very easily from seed. However, they do very well in tissue culture. And so this is good for mass production of disease-free plants, and this also ensures year-round production. The idea here is that you're growing out these plants on a particular kind of media that stimulates root and shoot growth. And it can look something like this. You can take it from the shoot, you can take it from other parts of the plant, and you induce a callus, something like here at the top. And over time, given the right nutrients and the right hormones, it's going to induce root and shoot growth. And then you can remove the embryo and essentially grow it out in soil and generate the entire plant from that. And so that's really what some plant producers have to do if they have very difficult plants that don't graft well or don't produce seed well, or other issues that can be overcome with tissue culture. I would say in general, this is the most expensive way to propagate a plant. However, if you're doing it on a large enough scale, like with these orchids you would find in the grocery store, it's a reasonable way to go. So this is really going to wrap us up talking about vegetative propagation, and we'll move on from here.